The subject of today's lecture is an introduction to brain anatomy. There are two takeaways here. Number one, the brain is composed of physical tissues imbued with specific functions. If you damage those tissues, you damage those functions. I want to stress this because it's a major theme of the course, that the brain is a physical organ. You might recall it was the first item to be checked off in our pre-flight checklist way back in lecture number 1. Now, there's a tendency to overlook this and to view the brain as somehow special and separate from the rest of the body, and to think of the mind as somehow distinct from the brain. But no, the brain is a physical phenomenon just as much as the heart and the lungs, and we should judge illnesses that afflict the brain no differently than other illnesses of the body. I'll expand on this more at the end of this talk. Now for takeaway number 2. Number 2. As far as brain science is concerned, there's no statute of limitations for being weird. With those ideas in mind, let's get started. Our opening story underscores today's weirdness. It concerns people suffering from achinotopsia, a condition first described before World War I. Achinotopsia is also called motion blindness. Achinotopsia can be difficult to detect in people because, on the surface, everything seems normal. These patients identify objects and people with ease. They read books with ease, recognize people and places. Their visual perceptions seem pretty typical. Except they're not. People with motion blindness can see and identify objects and people with ease only as long as the objects and people remain stationary. If the objects move, these people cannot detect their motion. They can't perceive a car moving towards them. They can't perceive the motion of a thrown baseball or a flying airplane. They cannot detect smooth motion. They cannot detect motion at all. What they see instead is a parade of successive snapshot-like non-moving images. It's just like they're looking at an animator's drawings, one picture at a time. This occurs because of damage in a specific area in the back of the brain. You know what that means? It means there is a specific area in the back of the brain dedicated to processing the existential concept of movement of an object, divorced from any other information about that object. Achinotopsia is thankfully rare, but it's not trivial. Sufferers are in mortal danger if they try to cross the street. That's because they can't detect a car coming at them. They often turn away when people are talking because they can't sync up the lips of the person with the sounds coming out of their mouth. It's like living inside a badly dubbed Godzilla movie. They even have a hard time at crowded parties. People pop in and out of their visual field like some malfunctioning Star Trek transporter. Here's the point. People with motion blindness do not have a mental illness in the back of their souls. They have a physical injury in the back of their brains. That fact underscores both takeaways in this lecture. Your brain is a physical organ whose tissues have a job description: to process information for the purposes of surviving the day's challenges. If those tissues get injured, that processing may go haywire. It may hurt your ability to survive the day's challenges, even if you try to cross the street. That can seem weird. It is, in fact, quite physical, and that's the point. This is the lens through which I view our lecture. The overall purpose is to provide an introductory tour through brain anatomy, but using this viewpoint. That said, our tour today is divided into 3 parts. First, we'll talk about historical perspectives on brain structure and function. It's entitled Mind and Brain. Second, we'll mention a few ground rules before beginning the tour. The section is entitled Of Troy, Charlton Heston, and 2 Ground Rules. The third is entitled The Grand Tour Itself, the core of this lecture. Scientists divide the brain into 3 overall regions called the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. We'll pay attention to all of them. We end our tour with a familiar idea. This neurological trinity works together for purposes of survival. This can only happen because of its physical nature. Forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain follow the same rules of physics and chemistry as any other biological tissue. Now, I realize that can seem uncreative, maybe hard-nosed, coldly scientific as a perspective, but it's my perspective and also many of my colleagues' perspective, so you should know that before we get into part one. Okay, I'm done. Let's get into part one. Believing that the brain follows biologically physical rules has historically been a tough sell. A lot of it's due to ignorance. For centuries, nobody knew what the brain did. That's really understandable. The brain just sits there, the consistency of cold jello floating silently in its dark, isolated cranial vault. Aristotle, for one, completely ignored the organ. He thought the heart was the seat of our information processing. The heart beats, after all, even if you excise it from the chest. It reassuringly does something. Hippocrates, considered in the West to be the father of modern medicine, also got many things wrong about our noggin. His view on hysteria is a particularly powerful example. The modern concept of hysteria ranges from paralyzed hands to unregulated screaming on airplanes. We know these behaviors originate in the human brain. Hippocrates thought hysteria had nothing to do with the human brain. He thought it had everything to do with the human uterus. He explained that hysteria was the fault of a wandering womb, hence the word hyster. Hysterectomy means uterine removal. The uterus was thought at times to migrate to various places in the body, causing internal behavioral mayhem and only to women. The cure involved calming the uterus down. Plato thought this dandy. He added that the surest way to settle this unruly organ down was to marry women and get them pregnant. Things improved only slowly with the passing of millennia, but they did improve. Scooching up a few centuries, we bring into this mix the 17th century ideas of René Descartes, who ended up saying one really insightful thing and one thing that was, less insightful. First, the really insightful thing. Descartes coined the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, meaning I think, therefore I am. Since thinking involves the brain, not the heart or the uterus, he wins the biological geography quiz. He also said it held our identity, which to this day is an interesting way to look at brain function. Descartes is also famous for advocating and defending something called mind-brain dualism. This is an idea most scientists will charitably describe as not even wrong, mostly because it's not testable. Mind-brain dualism states that the mind and the body are fundamentally made of different stuff. The mind is a non-physical entity, the body is a physical entity, so it's like a wine bottle. The bottle is made of glass, the wine is made of juice. One bottle of wine, two distinctive substances, dualism. Our soul, or whatever intersecting incorporeal entity you propose, is the wine poured into our brain, the bottle. Science no longer thinks in those terms. We have mostly embraced the idea of physicalism. I've stated a form of physicalism at the intro to this lecture, asserting flatly that the brain follows physical and chemical rules. Necessary for our understanding of its function and, may I add, sufficient. That doesn't mean the shadows of dualism have completely evaporated. There's a modern version of this old debate, usually called the mind-brain problem. People have wondered how a non-physical wish, like, I think I will move my leg now, consummates with the physical act of leg movement. Mind interacts with brain. How does that work? Well, we don't have time to address this question fully, so let me just summarize what I believe. I believe the mind is something the brain does, a great part of which is devoted to surviving. I don't believe there is a ghost in the machine. I believe the ghost is the machine. The mind is an emergent property arising from the interaction of electricity with flesh. I thought you should know this before we get into section 2 and start our anatomical tour. All right, that said, let's move into part 2. Time for this brain of ours to get its close-up. We begin, appropriately enough, with a movie. Actually, we'll begin with an archaeological dig that reminded me of a movie. I was touring through Turkey, looking at the archaeological dig of the ancient city of Troy, or better to say, cities of Troy. I was listening to our tour guide talking about the alternating cycles of building and destruction and rebuilding that puts one version of the city on top of another, and just like all digs, by the time of the Roman Empire, Troy was on its 9th version. The topmost, he explained, is always the most recent version. The bottom, the most ancient. This makes archaeological digs as close to a time machine as science gets. You can see the history of civilizations just by walking up or down a few steps. Which layer Achilles inhabited, if any, my guide couldn't say. That's okay, because I wasn't listening to him. My thoughts instead had drifted to a scene from the original Planet of the Apes movie, the one starring Charlton Heston. This movie features talking apes that have taken over the world. Humans are there, but they're subordinate. They can no longer speak. Great satire. Great mystery, too. Was Heston on a brand new world? A topsy-turvy version of our old world? The scene in which I was reminiscing answers these questions. It takes place in a multi-layered archaeological dig, just like the one at which I was gazing. Heston's at the bottom, the most ancient layer, when he discovers a human doll. The doll actually speaks, something humans aren't supposed to do. Heston utters famously to religious scholar Dr. Zaius, "Doctor, would an ape make a human doll that talks?" Pivotal scene for the movie. Pivotal idea for our lecture. Believe it or not, the brain is constructed something like an archaeological dig. It consists of recent evolutionary additions piled on top of ancient old structures. We're going to take a tour of this organ the same way we might visit Troy or the dig at the Planet of the Apes. We'll start at the top, the newest regions, then proceed downward to the inner, most evolutionarily ancient ones. Let's get started, beginning with some ground rules as our tour leaves the station. First rule, pay attention to the wrinkles. The brain looks like one long breakfast sausage stuffed into a grapefruit. It's convoluted, it's wrinkled. You will see ridges called gyri and valleys called sulci all over its surface. The reason for the hills and valleys, the gyri and the sulci, come from neurological overcrowding. The hardened volume of the cranium is tough to enlarge. If you want to have bigger brains occupying the same space, the only way is to start jamming these in. The brain is actually the size of a grapefruit, but the surface of the brain, called the cerebral cortex, if unfolded, is about 2.5 square feet, roughly the size of a baby blanket. That's why you have the wrinkles. Otherwise, the brain just won't fit. Pay attention to these. Much that makes us human occurs in these hills and valleys. Second rule, don't be intimidated by the jargon. As the early anatomists started exploring these neurological hills and valleys, and eventually the interior structures inside them, they started naming what they saw with some really strange sounding words. Don't be overwhelmed by those words. The explorers named these structures after objects that reminded them of everyday things, just like most explorers do. Why it might sound exotic is that they used the Greek and Roman equivalents of these objects, which was the stuffy scientific thing you did in those days. There's a structure called the pons. Pons simply means bridge, and that's a good name. The pons looks and acts something like a bridge. The almond-shaped amygdala is appropriately named. Amygdala means almond in Greek. There are even twinned teardrop-shaped structures deep in the brain called the mammillary bodies. They're called that because they supposedly reminded the explorer of his wife's breasts. There's no need to be intimidated by these fanciful names. They just aren't in English. Okay, on to part 3, the grand tour itself. The tour begins with a magic wand. Let's say you wave it over somebody's head and immediately the top of their skull disappears like Hannibal Lecter without the fava beans or the psychopathology. What do you see? You see a wrinkled exterior that looks like a tortured landscape suitable for an actual archaeological dig. It also looks like a large walnut. It's those gyri and sulci, the hills and valleys we were discussing. Scientists divide this over-convoluted, over-named archaeological walnut into 3 regions: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Most everything you see when you remove the top of the skull is the forebrain, and that's where we'll begin. The forebrain has a slick surface. Like an archaeological dig, the evolutionarily newest part of the forebrain, indeed the entire brain, is on this slick surface. It's called the cortex, Latin for bark. This bark is the stuff that really makes us human. No other creature has one quite like ours. The cortex is divided into 4 subregions called lobes. If you put your hand behind your head, please feel free to dispense with the Hannibal Lecter metaphor, you are just millimeters away from the first region called the occipital lobe. It's responsible for vision. Push your hand up a little towards the top, about where you'd normally place headphones. You're millimeters away from the second lobe of the cortex, the parietal lobe. This lobe is responsible for processing sensory signals, including your ability to feel touch and pain. Drop your hands to the sides of your head, where Princess Leia of Star Wars has her famous hair buns. Your hands are right next to your temporal lobes, the third region. These are responsible for memory. Finally, put your hand on your forehead. Then take off your sandals, because you're on the brain's holy ground. You are just millimeters away from the prefrontal cortex, the smartest, evolutionarily youngest part of your brain in a cortex already famous for being new. The reason for my sandals quip is that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for most of the thinking processes that humans hold sacred. The prefrontal cortex, in many ways, defines what it means to be human. These holy thinking processes include cognitive functions, like the ability to understand calculus. It's also involved in emotional regulation, restraining yourself from punching people when you're in a bad mood. It's the calming Einstein of your brain, vanguard of the 4th and final region, the frontal lobe, which lies just back of it. Taken together, you have the occipital lobe, vision, parietal lobe, pain and touch, temporal lobe involved in memory, and the frontal lobe tipped by its fancy prefrontal cortex for calculus and civility. The forebrain's cortex is thin, between 2 and 4 millimeters thick on average. It's also boring. We might be tempted, like Aristotle, to ignore the cortex because it just sits there all slick and smart. You might very well ask, how do we know what the cortex does? The answer might surprise you. We know a great deal about cortical function because of the 20th century's 2 big fat world wars. There were several contributions. First, these wars were the first global-scale engagements regularly involving shrapnel, which could penetrate the skull, lodge in the cortex. Second, with advances in battlefield medicine, soldiers would get smallish shrapnel wounds in specific areas of their cortex and lose certain functions, but they wouldn't lose their lives. An examination of their lost functions, in some cases gained functions, told us something about what the cortical region did. The classical composer Dmitri Shostakovich is a terrific example. Though the account may be apocryphal, he supposedly received shrapnel in a specific area of the brain that actually helped him process his music. The shrapnel was never removed. Whenever he needed inspiration, Shostakovich said he just tilted his head to a particular angle, which would increase blood flow to the wounded area. Melodies would suddenly appear in his mind. Shostakovich would write them down. With thousands of such conflict-mediated wounds, it didn't take too long before we had a functional map of the cortex. We'll have more to say about individual regions throughout this lecture series. On that sad note, let us continue our tour. We'll stay in the forebrain, but now we're going to go deeper, moving beneath the cortex. If we go low enough, we will see the cortex looking like the sky arcing over an ancient complex neurological set of kingdoms. These kingdoms are the interior structures of the forebrain. The first structures you see are loosely called the limbic system. The limbic system reminded the discoverer of a border because that's what limbic means. It actually looks like a scorpion carrying a large partially divided egg on its back. It faces claws forward near the center of your brain. The claws of the scorpion, left and right, are called the amygdalae, which are responsible for much of the emotional processing you do during the day. The two arms connecting those claws to the scorpion's body are called the hippocampi, singular hippocampus. These regions are profoundly involved in memory formation. The tail that arches over the body of the scorpion, like the letter C, is the fornix. The fornix connects your memory systems to far-flung regions of the brain. So, that's the body of the scorpion. Amygdala looking like a claw, hippocampus looking like a leg, fornix looking like a stinger. What about that large partially divided egg on its back? That structure is called the thalamus. It's underneath the stinger, nestled atop the scorpion's back. To hopelessly mix metaphors, you can think of the thalamus not so much like an egg, but like oval electrical switchboard systems. The thalamus takes in a great deal of information coming from the external senses and routes it off to various regions of the brain. Thalamus means apartment for women, deriving either from the ancient Greek thalamus, meaning inner chamber, or thalamium, which was a Greek house for women, or it might derive from tholos, which means vault. Anyhow, underneath the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which means, not surprisingly, under the bedroom. It's responsible for many of our most primal urges, including fear, appetite, and sexual feelings. So as a bedroom, it's more of a near hit. Primal urges means that we are descending increasingly into the primitive areas of the brain. Before we leave the forebrain entirely, it might be useful to rocket back to the surface and take one last overall look. You'll see the forebrain is actually two brains, which we call hemispheres, a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. This is consistent with nearly everything else we've been discussing. There are two amygdalae, one in each hemisphere, two hippocampi, one in each hemisphere, and a semi-divided egg in the middle. These hemispheres can work in a semi-independent fashion, but they're connected in the middle with the neurological cabling called the corpus callosum. This cabling allows the two semi-independent hemispheres to talk to each other. That's important, for if you break the connection, they can lose their ability to negotiate. This is what happened with the poor woman whom I described to you earlier, the one with alien hand syndrome, whose left hand was trying to kill her while her right hand fought hard to protect her. Kurt Goldstein, the neurobiologist who was treating her, hypothesized, correctly it turned out, that her hemispheres had stopped coordinating with each other. One side of her brain perhaps held depressive ideation. It was certainly attempting suicide. The other hemisphere had somehow not gotten the memo and was rightfully horrified at what the left was trying to do to her. At her autopsy, it was confirmed that her corpus callosum, that connecting cabling, had suffered a massive stroke and the hemispheres were no longer talking to each other. And no, her left arm did not kill her. She died of another stroke. If that isn't a physical thing to say, I don't know what else is. Actually, I do know what else is. We have more examples of this physicality in the next stops on our tour, visiting increasingly more ancient parts of our brain. We will now leave the forebrain and make two more stops. First, the midbrain, and next, the hindbrain. Let's continue our descent. If you could wave another magic wand and clear away the forebrain, what would be left would look something like a pregnant popsicle stick from which two large sprigs of cauliflower dangle. The pregnant popsicle stick is called the brainstem. The brainstem is just the swollen tip of your spinal column, but it's the part that connects the brain to the rest of the body. That's why it's swollen. Inside this brainstem are the oldest parts of your brain, the midbrain and the hindbrain. The two dangling balls of cauliflower are collectively called the cerebellum, which we'll get to shortly. Let's start with the midbrain. Like I said, the midbrain is embedded in the popsicle stick, the brainstem. It lies just under the forebrain, which balloons around it. The midbrain's biggest claim to fame is that it keeps you consciously alert, aroused. Amongst these arousal responsibilities is sleep regulation. Slip a wire into the specific area of the midbrain of a cat, turn on the juice, and you can get the animal to fall asleep instantly. Stimulate another area of the midbrain, and that sleeping animal will suddenly become wide awake. The midbrain has circuits that allow you to turn on and off consciousness, whatever that is, like a light switch. Damage to the midbrain often results in a coma. The other resident of the brainstem is the hindbrain, which for some reason also includes those twin cauliflower-like structures, the cerebellum. The hindbrain is involved in vital life support functions. That includes regulating your respiration and your heart rate. If those don't function, you don't live. Alcohol works its lethal magic here. If you drink too much alcohol, you can suppress the hindbrain activity, and that can lead to death. The other area of the hindbrain, sprouting from the brainstem, is the cauliflower-like cerebellum. Cerebellum means little brain because that's kind of what it looks like. Two tiny brains dangling from the back of the big brain like ancient earrings. The cerebellum's historically major claim to fame is coordinating muscular movement. It actually does much more than that, but we'll leave that for another time. Go ahead and try to type on a computer with your arms constantly shooting out from the keyboard. Without a cerebellum, that's exactly what happens. Now, as I mentioned, the midbrain and the hindbrain represent the two most ancient parts of the brain. They are the regions furthest down from the top of that young cortex we discussed a bit ago. We sometimes call these old regions the lizard brain because they look and function in us the same way they look and function in lizards. This also means we've ended our tour, and in about 3 minutes, this lecture. Before we finish, I'd like to revisit its overarching point in the practical application closing section. It involves the frank physicality of the human brain. I have spent several decades looking at the genetics of psychiatric disorders. Though I'm not an MD, I often run across people who feel depressed and anxious. So much so, I even wrote a book about depressive disorders. I can't tell you the number of times I have heard people suffering from depressive illness tell me it was their fault, that depression was a personal failing, a private weakness, that if only they were strong enough, they could pull themselves up by their emotional bootstraps and life would return to normal. They had no clue their brain marches to the same drumbeat of physics and chemistry that drills the rest of the body. They didn't understand that the brain's job was to process information typically, and that when it malfunctioned, which is what can happen in a depressive illness, the first thing to go would be the ability to process information typically. This is not the result of a personal fault. This is the result of a biological organ. I would ask them, look, if you were born with diabetes and had to take insulin for the rest of your life, would that be a personal failing? A private weakness? If only you had enough personal strength, couldn't you just get over your need for insulin, pull yourself up by your diabetic bootstraps and get on with healthy living? Silly, isn't it? The need to supply insulin is not a personal failing. It's just physics and chemistry. This entire series is predicated on this notion that the brain is a physical organ, a Darwinian survival machine. I apologize if I sound preachy for revisiting this, but this idea is foundational. And I hope that going through this neuroanatomical archaeological tour and providing some exotic examples along the way, you can see why I and so many of my colleagues feel this way. In the next lecture, we're going to move to the most intimate biological level possible in the brain. We're going to enter the world of the cell, molecule, atom. But we will find the same lesson, same physics, same chemistry, both welcoming us home. It's as if we'd never left. Just like Charlton Heston in the original Planet of the Apes.